the most important kind of prerequisite is simply that you care. I said to this broadcast, I'm like, so you're willing to platform climate disinformation? Well, I can't do it all, but here is the piece of the puzzle that I can focus on. But we need to reach a social tipping point where those solutions and alternatives become the norm rather than the very destructive industries that we have today, based on the premise that people are fundamentally rational. And I've just learned that that's totally untrue.
Just remaining honest. EVs, yes, perfect, but still notice what we are doing and who we're affecting. Welcome to the Leaf Media Global Podcast, a space for professionals, enthusiasts dedicated to ESG. In this series, we are highlighting inspiring careers, innovative strategies, and bold visions which are tackling climate and social emergencies. I'm your host, Sam Smith-Stanley, a climate engagement manager at Greenly, hosting this first UK season where we spotlight leaders reshaping sustainability in business and communities worldwide. Briefly, before we get onto our guest, this podcast is produced by Leaf Media and powered by Greenly. Greenly is a leading ESG management solution with a climate suite helping companies to measure, report, and manage their carbon footprint. We operate in both Europe and the US, and we have tools such as automated GHG reporting, helping companies comply with things like SBTi and regulations such as CSRD, and we offer supplier engagement support and life cycle assessments. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome an incredible guest. We are very lucky and complete fans of this person who's kind of a very formidable person in the scene, a Clover Hogan. You may recognize Clover as in the previous episode with Mike Berners-Lee. She cleverly invited him to answer one of her questions, which we might ask at the end of this podcast. Clover is a passionate climate activist, really engaging young people and old into the climate cause. She founded Force of Nature, a youth-led non-profit, and is a powerhouse in turning climate anxiety into action. At just 22, she's named Forbes Under 30, and she's worked alongside global leaders in sustainability, consulted Fortune 50 companies, and shared the stage with the likes of Jane Goodall and Vandana Shiva. Clover's TED Talk, What to Do When Climate Change Feels Unstoppable, has already reached over 2 million views, inspiring people worldwide. Clover, welcome to the podcast. We are very grateful for your time.
Oh, thank you very much. So much for having me. That was such a stellar introduction. I feel like I should carry you around in my pocket so you can introduce me to everyone.
Perfect. I'm in. Don't have. I'll do it free of charge.
Okay. Sounds good. We'll talk off camera. Yeah.
Yeah. We'll sort that. First question, actually. Tell us about the last time you felt like you were a bad activist.
Ooh, this is a great spicy one to start with. Yeah. I mean, I guess for background, I started on my climate activist journey when I was about 11. I discovered documentaries and it was like my reality bubble was suddenly burst. Mm-hmm. I hadn't learned about the climate crisis in school. We didn't talk about it at the dinner table. I didn't see it on the news when my, parents watched TV. Yeah. And, I remember feeling really confused for that reason. But also this, fiery kind of passion and determination. And so when I was 11, I told my parents over dinner one night that I wanted to become an activist. And I think at that time, I didn't just vow to be an activist. I think in my mind, I was kind of vowing to be the most devout activist possible. And so, of course, as many of us do, that kind of microscope first turned to my own life. So I stopped eating meat. I stopped, shopping fast fashion. I would interrogate my family every time they, proposed a trip on a plane overseas. Mm-hmm. And the more you learn, the bigger you realize the problems are, the more intersectional. And, I think what started off as trying to live in a way that was aligned with my values became almost this like competition to be the most perfect activist possible. And that was a standard that I not only held myself to, but that I tried to hold all of my, friends and family to as well. And with time, as I began to appreciate the kind of systemic nature of the problems we're up against, I realized how in some ways futile. Many of those kind of individually orientated actions really are, but also how limiting they can be if we're so focused on trying to live, perfectly and absolutely consistently. That can be really, really frustrating in a system that makes it inherently difficult to do the right or responsible thing. And so a few years ago, I started talking about what it means to really be an inconsistent activist. And I definitely didn't invent the term bad activist. There's a great organization called the Bad Activist Collective at one point that, my friends, Tori and Domi were involved in, two other amazing youth climate justice activists. But really it was, this shared understanding that actually we need to stop kind of pointing the finger at ourselves, at one another, and keep our sights set on the bigger systemic changes. So that was a great avoidance of the question, but to answer it fully, I mean, I think I'm a bad activist all the time. Like I'm, drinking a cup of coffee, and that is incredibly resource intensive. I do fly home every year to see my family. I do buy, new clothes because you can't get, socks at the charity shop. But I think that is kind of an inevitable aspect of just living in the world we do. And as much as living in a way that is values aligned, I think can be empowering, we shouldn't get too bogged down in that, and in doing so lose sight of the bigger picture.
Yeah, I think honesty kind of on both sides, honesty when you're being that bad activist, but then being honest with the challenges of trying to be more sustainable in this world. It is difficult with the charity shop. If you don't have the socks, maybe sometimes you do have to buy something, but maybe if you're consistent with everything else, and maybe who knows, you might donate those socks, or you might donate a bag or whatever, and it kind of can go full circle. So staying consistent and honest, I think, is the best way. Now, your story is quite amazing in what you've done so far. I want to jump to something more recent, which is a viral moment of yourself and a very famous figure named Elon Musk. I believe he turned you into a meme one day. Can you take us to that? And maybe the morning when you woke up, your phone was buzzing, and did you know immediately that you could channel that into, or leverage it for your own kind of platform and voice? Or was it, oh no, I've got 170 million eyes on me or more, and this is a terrible moment?
Yes, this was a surreal situation, I think is the only appropriate word for it. So as a little bit of background, much of my work, I'm not only talking about the importance for climate action, but how in, transitioning to a better world, a more sustainable world, we have to make sure that we're not leaving certain communities behind. And, I was on this panel in Paris, and I was talking about the danger of silver bullet solutions. And I happened to use electric vehicles as an example. I said, EVs are obviously going to be part of the green transition, but we can't overlook the fact that, they're already causing untold, human rights abuses in the supply chains, whether you're looking at the mining of lithium or cobalt. It's the most vulnerable communities in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo who are paying the human cost of these technologies. And so really it was just to highlight that and to say, we have to talk about a just transition. And in pursuit of green technologies, we shouldn't be, taking advantage of and exploiting the people who have historically been marginalized through a history of, colonization.
It goes back to you being honest as well. And even with the buying of something that isn't from a charity shop, it's just remaining honest. EVs, yes, perfect, but still notice what we are doing and who we're affecting.
Yeah, exactly. And not kind of pretending that technology is just magically going to erase all of these problems, particularly when it comes to global inequality. So that was the context. So that was the panel. I posted a few excerpts. And one morning, a few days after, I wake up and I've got this flurry of messages from friends, good friends, and people I haven't spoken to in years. And they're saying, oh my God, saw what happened. Hope you're okay. Oh my gosh, saw the post, you're my hero. Like this real range of messages. I'm like, what is this about? Like, this is so left of field. And I opened my computer, and there on Twitter, now X, is my face, which has been photoshopped into a meme format in which I'm declaring myself a communist. And I read the name that's posted it, Elon Musk, and I'm like, okay, well, that can't be real. This must be like a spoof account. I refresh it, click on his profile, and sure enough, it's him. And he's the one who has put this out there. And when I first saw it, I think it was on 6 million views. I refresh it, it's 10 million. It's just kind of increasing in views exponentially. And the messages under that post were really horrendous. Like, I'm used to trolling. I think it's an unfortunate, but, kind of part of the job as a climate activist. But, just really vile language, rape threats, death threats, everything. And even within that short space of time, it wasn't just on, X, but I was getting emails. People found my email online. I was getting WhatsApp messages. We had a job posting at the time for, a new role at Force of Nature, and people were submitting hate messages, racially motivated messages to the team under the guise of applications. So it went from 0 to 100 really quickly. And at that time, I really didn't have any opportunity to kind of process it. As your question alluded to, I was like, how do I make the most of this moment, right? How do I draw, attention to the issue that I started talking about, which is like human rights and inequality. And so I woke up my partner, who is a content creator. That's his job. He never wakes up before like 9 a.m., even on a good day. And yet it was 7 a.m. And when I said Elon Musk has turned me into a meme, I've never seen him so alert. He like launched out of bed, and he was the best person to have in my camp, because he was like, all right, let's go into PR mode. Like, how do we use this? So we went on a deep dive about Elon Musk. We created a counter meme. We were able to kind of leverage the moment. And it was a good way of kind of like, letting go of some of that adrenaline and energy. But then, of course, in the kind of aftermath of it, it all really started to settle in. And I think a lot of people at that time said, well, this is evidence that you're winning, right? Like, if you're ruffling the feathers of the world's richest man, that can only be a good thing. But I felt kind of exposed in a way that I never have before. My face was turned into an NFT at one point. There were multiple Reddit threads. Because he hadn't tagged me, the internet launched its own investigation into who I was, trying to unearth every detail of my life. And I just had to delete all of my socials and go offline for a few weeks and kind of just hibernate so that I could make sense of it, make sense of an unbelievable situation, and then come back to the work without that fear or anxiety that moment really generated.
I'm so sorry to hear that's happened to you, because I mean, I'm glad that you've turned it into such a force of energy, and it's not the first time he's done that. He's got a big responsibility, and he feels just a single post here and there doesn't mean anything, but I think he does understand the repercussions. So well done for turning it into, or shining a light on that bad behavior, but also then kind of growing your voice and amplifying your voice. And it seems like you got some great people in your camp as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was so fun, because after the fact, after I kind of recovered from it, I like turned it into a t-shirt that said Elon Musk turned me into a meme.
Great.
Which was a great conversation starter for people who might not be that interested in climate, because that is enough to kind of like hook them. I incorporated the story into a TED Talk, which has just been published. So yeah, I feel like I tried to leverage it as best possible, but it is kind of surreal in a world that feels like increasingly chaotic and bizarre. So
yeah, well, thank you that you're still here and being the activist that you are. And we're gonna kind of leave Elon behind for now, and talk about activism in general. And I mean, we were kind of looking at the word and its roots, and I think actus, I think, is the Latin origin, which means it's a driving force, which I feel like you are a driving force in this moment. And I kind of wanted to say activist, the word activist is being weaponized at the moment to kind of say it's a bad thing. I wonder how you navigate that, because they do look at young people and they say it's idealistic and unrealistic, and you're an activist. What does that mean? Full-time activist, what does that mean? And they kind of weaponize it against you. So I kind of wanted to steer towards what you think an activist is, and we've touched upon it with the bad activist side of things, but then how do you view the weaponization of it? And then what would you say also to maybe not older generations, but people that say young activists are unrealistic and idealistic in their campaigns?
Such a great question. I mean, the first thing I would say, there's an amazing author, Rebecca Solnit, who wrote a beautiful book called Hope in the Dark, which I turn to anytime I'm feeling really downtrodden about the state of the world. And she has a line in there which is so insightful. something like, the media likes to vilify activism and activists, unless it is, far away, was long ago, or ideally both. And that feels so true because, we look to previous activist movements, whether it was, the suffragettes or the civil rights movement, the Stonewall Uprising, anti-apartheid. We look to those movements of activists and we say, well, how brave were these people for, demanding justice, for fighting for their rights, for acting in the face of such tremendous opposition. And yet, at the time, those people were, often vilified, and particularly by the media. I went on a deep dive, understanding the suffragettes, who, obviously are the reason why, I, as a woman in the UK, have the right to vote, and were able to deliver the Equal Franchise Act in 1928, less than a century ago. And you look at the way the media described those activists at the time, and they were, depicted as radicals, disgusting, emasculating mankind, bad mothers. It was all about kind of assassinating their character to really make the message about them rather than the problems that they were fighting up against and the causes that they were fighting for. And we see the same tactics today, whether it's directed at Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion. Many of these movements have taken the playbook of those people-powered movements. They use the same tactics, just as, the suffragettes destroyed, artworks or defaced buildings or, chained themselves to railings. Actually, by comparison, I think they're a bit more extreme than many of the movements today. But all of that same rhetoric is kind of directed at activists. So I think, there is a very deliberate strategy to try and undermine activists. And we see that anytime a young activist, particularly a young woman, goes on, a talk show, it becomes immediately back to this idea of the bad activist. It's, oh, but you're a hypocrite, right? Your clothes are made from oil. How did you get here today? Who are you to say we should be, demanding X, Y, Z? So I think it's important to highlight that strategy that is employed, particularly by the right-wing press and by the Murdoch press, for example, in this country, in America, in my home country of Australia. And to really just, clear away that noise to focus on, well, what does it mean to be an activist? And for me, being an activist very simply means being someone who cares, whether that's about racial justice, whether that's about the climate, having a livable future, and simply choosing to act on that care. And that doesn't have to be protesting in the street. If that's not your cup of tea, that's okay. That can just be having a conversation at work. It can be, chatting to your boss about your job and seeing how you can align it in a more values-led way. It can be lobbying your local politician, signing a petition. There are so many ways that you can choose to engage. And I think one of the really clever tactics of, people in positions of power is to frame what we're asking for as radical. And I was asked that the other day. I was like, well, don't you think that you're a bit idealistic? Don't you think what you're asking for is radical? And I was like, I'm asking for clean air, clean water. I'm asking that a small number of people are not allowed to accumulate the majority of the planet's wealth and resources at the expense of everyday working class people. I'm asking for a livable future. Those are not radical things.
It's bizarre to frame it as radical as well. I was chatting to Mike in the last podcast about Climate of Truth, and I mentioned something about the Welsh Assembly or something was mentioning, and need to be fact checked on this, but they want to introduce it to be illegal to tell a lie. So you have to tell the truth. And I'm like, what? That's radical, is it? To just tell the truth? That's a bizarre idea to implement in, and you're explaining that, right? Clean air.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we've kind of been, many of us are quite numb, and I think we've been indoctrinated into a lot of really messed up systems and messed up norms. Oxfam put out an incredible report recently on global inequality, and they found that actually, we're not progressing to greater equality. Like, people are getting poorer. There's a cost of living crisis in almost every country around the world. Of the biggest 10 corporations globally, 7 of them either have a billionaire CEO or a billionaire primary shareholder. This is when people are struggling to put food on the table, are struggling to pay their energy bills. suggesting that we change that system, in my view, is really not that radical. And so I think it's really important when we talk about activism that, again, it can become a stigmatized word, but it's as simple as fighting for your rights and fighting for the rights of, future generations as well, knowing that we inherit this incredible legacy of activism that comes before us, which many of us, of course, take for granted.
Would you say then, because you have some people that feel, some young activists that might feel the imposter syndrome, and as you said, some of them are not ready to maybe protest, what advice would you give them then? Is it that you can start being the bad activist and just start changing a few things here and there and being that driving force, however little or large? Is that your advice to them who feel that they don't have what it takes to be an activist?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think you have to be perfect. Like, none of us are perfect or even close to it. And so, you should just get started on the issues that you care about. And for me, always, I didn't go to university. I don't have the traditional qualifications that many other people do. And because of that, I remember feeling a lot of imposter syndrome, right? Like, I'm not a climate scientist. Who am I to say, these are the changes we need? But I've come to realize that the most important kind of prerequisite is simply that you care. We've all inherited this world. We're all custodians of it. And I want to have a say over the world that I'm going to inherit, that my peers are going to inherit. And, I want to do everything in my power to be able to tell future generations, not yet born, that, we did what we could and we didn't just sit on the sidelines. So, I think activism is a beautiful thing, but you don't have to use that term if you don't feel comfortable. You can be an advocate, you can be a campaigner, or you can literally just be someone who cares, and that's okay as well.
That doesn't sound radical to me. That does not sound radical to me. In a world of doom and gloom headlines, then, can you shine a light on something that you either underreported or just you want to mention, something that's really kind of inspiring you at the moment, a movement, a project, or whatever? Because we are, as you say, in these echo chambers and the news we're fed. Sometimes we can control what we see, but it's quite hard sometimes. We're fed a lot of doom and gloom, especially in our space. There is a lot of bad things going on, but can you give us some sort of positivity, any projects that you're involved in or not involved in?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the first thing I would say is that I think so many of us have been feeling really overwhelmed, and especially given what's happening geopolitically at the moment. I think many of us had almost taken for granted this trend of progress, whether it's on climate or social impact, and we've seen a very quick reversal, not only on climate, but of course, like on D&I programs and a lot of corporations backtracking on their commitments. And I know even for me as a climate, communicator and campaigner, thinking a few years ago, okay, well, at least now, we've kind of won the war on climate disinformation and, people accept the science by and large. And yet, when he who shall not be named recently got into power, I was invited by a national broadcaster to, talk about COP, which was being hosted in Azerbaijan. And when I went on to the kind of prep call, the moderator mentioned, oh, yeah, and, here's the other speaker for the session. I was like, oh, I'm not familiar with his work. Look him up. And he's a climate denier. And
wonderful.
Yeah, I was so taken aback. And I said to this broadcaster, I'm like, so you're willing to platform climate disinformation? And they said, well, now that the president of the United States, that's his position, then we see it as important to reflect our views. And I was like, okay, but that was an ideology that we retired like over 10 years ago. The BBC, for example, used to platform climate disinformation. They made a very deliberate choice that actually it's super unhelpful. We're not going to do that. And I questioned them. I said, well, would you, platform a flat earther if you're going to platform conspiracy theorists? And they said, oh, well, no, we draw the line there. I looked this guy up and sure enough, he's also a flat earther.
Okay.
So, all to say, I think, it's so normal for people to be feeling overwhelmed, downtrodden. And yet what it is also important to recognize is that, the media, and particularly social media, which I think can feed a lot of that doom scrolling, gives us a very narrow view of the world. And yes, we're going backwards in many ways, but there is so much progress and there are so many people who are on the front lines, leading change, who never get the privilege of, a platform like this one, who, whose voices aren't heard, but they're just getting on with getting the work done. In terms of, projects and things that I find really inspiring, I mean, one that I recommend to everyone is Regeneration. So Paul Hawken, the climate scientist, he created Project Drawdown several years ago, which is the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. And then the follow-up to that was regeneration.org. So it's an amazing book, and it's an even better website that shows all of the industries and problems of the world, from palm oil to fashion to, a broken food system, energy system.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's super comprehensive. It's the work of thousands of researchers around the world. And it shows who the bad actors are, right? So who are the corporations that are contributing to these issues, and the governments, of course. He's done something pretty cheeky, which is find out the email addresses of the CEOs of those corporations and included them there. So you can send a really strongly worded email if you want to.
Yeah.
But I think even more importantly, he's really clearly coalesced all of the solutions to each of these issues on a political scale, a community scale, an individual level. And then he's linked to all of the organizations around the world who are already leading that change. So, there are incredible organizations at the grassroots, literally in every country, tackling these issues. And it is such a source of genuine inspiration and genuine hope to understand that there are so many of us out there, and we're not always aware, of what we're all kind of doing, but it's just a reminder. And it's a reminder as well that, to address the climate crisis, we don't need to wait for some far off unproven technology. We already have all the solutions.
Yeah.
We have all of the resources, but we need to reach a social tipping point where those solutions and alternatives become the norm rather than the very destructive industries that we have today.
Yeah, I mean, and we're going to leave that in the show notes. An amazing answer. So you're kind of explaining how entrenched you are in this world. Of course you are. It's a full-time job. You're an activist. You're everywhere speaking and inspiring. But first of all, advice for somebody getting into activism, but also for yourself, work-life balance, and even not just work-life balance, but we're trying to protect the planet. We're trying to save the planet. We're obsessed with nature and saving nature. Do you get a chance to enjoy nature still, and how do you balance your personal life as well?
Oh, such good questions. Okay, I'll take the easy one first, which is how to start engaging. I mean, I'd say the one piece of advice I give most people is to find focus. So I kind of alluded to this at the start of our conversation, where when you first learn about these issues, it's sort of a snowball. You're like, oh my gosh, there's a plastic crisis. Oh my gosh, and the climate is changing. And racial injustice underpins this, and that's connected to gender inequality. And it feels huge, right? And the climate crisis itself is a manifestation of all these broken systems. A very natural response to that is feeling incredibly overwhelmed, right? And I think so many people today care about all of these issues, right? But I believe that to have impact, we really need to find focus. And I think that's what the activists and change makers of past generations have done really effectively. They've said, okay, well, I can't do it all, but here is the piece of the puzzle that I can focus on. And so when I work with young people and students in particular, we go through that journey of finding, okay, well, what's that single issue that ignites a fire in your belly? And maybe it'll change. That's totally fine. But having that focus and then thinking about, well, what's my sphere of influence to be able to affect that problem, knowing that I'm not going to solve it single-handedly, is a great way to at least start on that journey. So that would be the first thing. In terms of navigating this world and like work-life balance, I mean, I'm like, who is she? Balance? Never met her. It's so hard because I think activism is not a 9-to-5 job. It's not something that you switch off from. And I know this is a shared experience with many young activists. When you do start in an early age, it becomes such a fundamental part of your identity that you don't really know who you are outside of it. And I think that's one of the reasons why, a couple of years ago, I burnt out really badly. I started getting super unwell. I developed like multiple chest infections. I was like, my body was in pain all the time. I lost my voice repeatedly. And unfortunately, I did not listen to my body at that time. I was like, my answer to that was like more ibuprofen and just like soldiering on. And I think that's a little bit in like the British culture as well, like stiff upper lip.
Just a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Keep calm, carry on.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it really had to reach a breaking point.
It works until it doesn't.
Yes, you know? Exactly.
And it often doesn't.
Yeah. And, you know, it's something that I'm actually working on a book at the moment, which we can maybe talk about. But I've been writing about this experience recently because back then I was working on a TED Talk, and it was all about this horrible experience that happened to my town growing up in Australia, where a fossil fuel company, they'd moved into a neighboring town. They destroyed the town. Half of the population developed cancer. They polluted the waterways. They polluted the air. People had to leave their homes. They couldn't sell them, so they were bought out for a fraction of the original price. And they just upped and left and tried to move into my hometown in Australia. And I'd never told this story before, but as I was writing it, it felt like the most important story that I've ever worked on because it's so personal. And, you know, those community members, they never saw their day in court. But as a storyteller, I was like, well, at least, you know, it won't be lost to history. And so I was really unwell as I was working on this talk, but I kept saying, okay, I just need to get over the finish line. I just need to deliver this talk and then I will take a break. I'll take a chill pill. And I delivered the talk. I lost my voice the week before, but I managed to soldier through. And then a few weeks later, when it was due to be published, I found out from the TED team that they didn't want to publish it because they were afraid of a defamation lawsuit from the fossil fuel company that I had named. Sure. And I just had a complete breakdown, you know, and it felt so poignant because I'd poured all of this energy into this talk, and I think I was able to justify it because I was like, okay, you know, the story is finally going to get out there, right? And I'd worked closely with this community to capture their stories, to get their consent to tell them, and to go back to them and say, this story has been squashed before it even had a chance to get out there. I just had a full-on breakdown. And, you know, it was really, really difficult, but it forced me to appreciate that I had not been living by the values that I espouse as an activist. You know, I talk often about how rest is an act of resistance in a system that tells us our only worth is our productivity and that encourages constant busyness. You know, so much of my work is grounded in mental health. That's been the focus of my work for, you know, almost a decade. And yet I had consistently put my mental health on the back burner. And I think so many of us are ensnared within this kind of culture of self-sacrifice within activism. You know, the movement, the cause, the challenge is always more important. And, you know, it's not a healthy way of approaching it, but it's difficult not to fall into that trap when it feels so urgent all the time. And so that moment, it forced me to really look in the mirror in a serious way. And it led to a whole host of kind of big life decisions, including the decision to step back from force of nature, which I did last year.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been a journey, and I wish I could say, you know, and now I'm all better and I'm really good at resting, but I think it will probably be a constant journey for me because, again, it's not something that or I think any of us can really just switch off from.
Well, can we then talk about force of nature, maybe setting it up, but then also taking a step back? And then you mentioned a book as well. Mm-hmm. So maybe we can do it in that order. That sounds good. Because force of nature is unbelievable, and kind of what led you to well, I guess I can understand how you created it, but and what led you to create it. But just tell me about that process, and then maybe the stepping back side of things into your writing phase.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I started Force of Nature when I was 19. At the time, I was working at a think tank and consultancy, which meant that I was often engaging with business leaders. And what really struck me was that, you know, these leaders within big companies, in many ways, were very similar, actually. And that was quite confronting for me. Like, they cared about the same issues. They cared about their children's futures. They were passionate about the problems. And yet I also saw how they had to do this real kind of mental gymnastics to justify business as usual. And so I felt quite disillusioned entering into a lot of those spaces. And so to kind of re-energize myself, while I was working as a consultant, I was volunteering in schools across the UK. And when I first went into a school, I was like, okay, climate change is not really on the curriculum. So what I'm going to do is help teach young people about, what's happening, what they can do. And yet I very quickly learned that they already knew a lot. In fact, they had an appreciation, understanding of climate change that even many of the business leaders I worked with didn't. These
Amazing.
young people understood the systemic nature of the crisis. They understood we should be focusing not on the symptoms of climate change, but on the root causes. They understood things like intersectionality, how racial justice connects to climate activism, for example. But what I heard from these young people was a serious sense of despair, of anxiety. I met young girls like 12, 13 years old who told me they'd already decided they didn't want to have children because they didn't want to bring them into a world on fire.
Wow.
I met 11-year-olds who told me about the apocalyptic dreams they were having about climate collapse. And I realized in those moments that, young people don't need to be convinced to care about climate change. Actually, they need to be supported to turn this anxiety and fear, a very justified fear they have about the state of the world and about their futures, turn that into action as a kind of outlet. And so that was really the inspiration for Force of Nature. And frankly, connecting with those young people was quite confronting, because I think I'd suppressed my own eco-anxiety for a long time. I thought I have to cling to like optimism and hope to do this work. And it was quite, jarring to hear young people just say it as it was. But it was also very refreshing coming out of a corporate environment where no one really permitted themselves to be human or to be honest about how they felt about, these problems.
Would you say that's what the younger generations maybe have to leverage in their kind of how they impact this argument, is that honesty?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think you see it, in really young people as well. It's like they haven't really been indoctrinated into systems perhaps of denial, of sticking your head in the sand. But they also have this amazing capacity to question everything. Why is the world the way that it is? And I remember going to this exhibition at the Natural History Museum on climate change, and there was a whole wall of sticky notes left by primary school students asking questions. And the questions were quite simple, why are we killing all of the world's, fish? Why are we destroying the oceans? Why are we chopping down the forests? And they're simple questions, but they're really profound.
Yeah, they are.
Because you start to scratch the surface and you're like, the knee-jerk reaction is, well, shareholders need to be able to make, quarterly profits.
Was that, and it goes back to what's radical, what's not, right?
Exactly.
You kind of that's not radical to care about that.
Yeah, and at some point we stop asking those questions, but there's such fundamental questions because they actually show how ludicrous their system really is. It's not fit for purpose. So working with young people, kind of to your point, it was a great way to, take those young people and say, okay, well, how do we help you create change in the world so that you don't feel so powerless, you don't feel disempowered? But then what we were able to do was actually take those young people into decision-making spaces. We set up youth advisory boards where young people were able to directly consult big corporates. We had young people engaging with policymakers, heads of state. Here is the actual voice of the next generation who are going to inherit the impacts of the decisions being made in Westminster, right? And so, it was such an incredible experience to grow this organization. It started off just as a, jumble of volunteers. And then we, hired an operations director. We got our, act together. We won our first grant. And, skip ahead almost 6 years now. And, Force of Nature is a 13-person team running programs all around the world. And, in many ways it was my baby. And so it was a very difficult decision to kind of step down. But I also knew it was the right decision to allow another generation of leadership to kind of step in and step up. And, part of me is actually a bit salty that they've done so well since I left. I'm like, you guys could have at least pretended to struggle for a bit. But honestly, they're just flying and they're doing so well. And it's so wonderful to see.
You should feel so proud then for setting that up, because you want to also hire people and that are better than you.
Yeah, 100%.
And that shows how well you've done, and incredible. So why did you step back? What was that kind of like? I know you said it was your baby, but what was the decision to do that? And is it because you want to dedicate your time to more of the writing side of things? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so I think it was partly this kind of burnout, but I think for
Yeah.
me as well, I think
Yeah.
anytime you make a decision like that, you don't want it to come from a reactive place
Yeah.
or a place of scarcity or fear. And so even after I had that burnout and took time to recover, I really thought about, the future of the organization and also just where my energy was going. And I think, having started it quite young, I probably didn't appreciate the responsibility that I was taking on at the time, because you're not just responsible for yourself, you're responsible first for 3 people, then 5, then 10, then 13, and making sure everyone, gets paid on time and you're able to run as a business. And it's such an exceptional kind of learning journey. But there was this one moment where we won our biggest grant to date. And I started crying like tears of joy. I was so relieved. I was like, oh, we can keep, doing this work. And then it quickly devolved into a bit of a panic attack because I was just thinking about having to get up and do it all over again the next day. And I think that's maybe the unfortunate aspect of starting an organization, is that for me, it started off going into classrooms, connecting with young people. That's always been what's really fulfilled me.
Yeah.
But then when you're running a business, and that's what it is ultimately, you're doing less and less of what you actually love.
Yeah.
Most of my job became like finance and fundraising. And I'm not a numbers person. I don't particularly love schmoozing funders.
You need to follow the energy, right?
Yes.
If you're getting energy from something and you're depleting energy in another way, you need to follow that.
Exactly. And there are people within the organization who did have that real drive to step into that role.
Yeah.
And it's amazing now because I get to, I chair our youth advisory board. And so I get to kind of step in, hear about the amazing work we're doing, offer any guidance that I can, but I'm otherwise allowing the team to just really run things by themselves. And I mean, also to your question, I think part of it was motivated by this desire to write. I love writing. I love communicating, and it's
storytelling.
Exactly.
Storytelling. You're so good at it.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah.
But I had so little time in my day-to-day job to even do that. And so for the past, 6 months or so, I've been working on this new book. The working title is The End of Pretending. And it's a series of memoirs and kind of vignettes from my experiences as an activist, which try to illuminate, why we are so good societally, collectively, at kind of switching off from, existential threats like climate change, and what is possible when we really open our eyes and wake up to what's happening. And also an exploration kind of to some of the questions we've been discussing about, how to do this long term with resilience, not knowing the outcome of our actions. There's no way to know whether we will, win or fail when it comes to climate. And the reality is it's not really a binary, right? Like every fraction of a degree matters, every life matters, every species, but it's a really difficult arena to be in. So how do we do this without the constant cycle of burnout? And how do we kind of save our own humanity in the process?
Great. Amazing. I can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
When is it set to be released? Is it still
to be confirmed?
Fine.
Yes,
Cool.
still in its proposal stage, but I've written about a quarter of it, which is exciting. But you'll be the first to know when I have a publishing date.
Amazing. And are you still working with companies and advising them? So often you find rigid environments. How do you influence the rigid environment and make change in these kind of big organizations, which I imagine have a lot of bureaucratic kind of systems in place? How do you change that? How do you spread responsibility? Because we work with so many business leaders, and sustainability kind of needs to be top down but bottom up as well, and it just needs to be spread across all people within businesses we see. And is that kind of something that you find yourself? How do you kind of how do you get it to work?
Yeah, so I still do quite a lot of work with companies, varying sizes. I mean, I do some work with like B Corps and disruptor companies, which is quite fun because it's already baked into their DNA. You don't have to like make the case for why this is important. But I think so many of our approaches to sustainability are based on the premise that people are fundamentally rational. And I've just learned that that's totally untrue. Like, I used to, when I prepared to go into companies, I'd go armed with all of my facts and stats and having, done this deep dive research. And yet, even if you present all of that information, even if you say, very simply, we are looking at ecological collapse, food system collapse. Like your entire industry is going to change. I remember when one of my advisors, 10 years ago told me, yeah, the insurance industry is going to collapse in your lifetime because homes and businesses are literally going to become uninsurable because of climate breakdown. That was inconceivable at the time. And now we're seeing exactly that unfold around the world. All to say, I think we think, oh, okay, well, present the facts, people will act on them. Very few people are that rational. And so what I've learned engaging with companies is it's all about interpersonal relationships, actually. It's all about connecting with people, helping them to understand their role and responsibility. I think one of the things that really surprised me the first time I engaged with business, these are people who have, tens of thousands of employees, have sometimes billion-dollar budgets. And yet I would speak to them and they would say, but what do you expect us to do? We're just as powerless as the next company, or it's up to policymakers, or, well, if consumers just asked for it, then we could. And that for me was such an interesting example of this kind of climate denial and disavowal of responsibility, of saying it's not up to me, it's up to someone else. And that helped me realize the importance of, connecting with these people on a human level to help them appreciate, like, no, you have so much power and influence here. And yes, you are operating within an economic system that makes it so difficult to actually follow your morals and your values. But if you're not going to do it, who is?
Yeah.
Right. And I think you can probably ask that question of literally anyone in the world, but especially when it comes to companies, they do have outsized influence. So in terms of the outcomes, I think we've seen some really great, initiatives and projects be born within these organizations as a result of engaging with them. But, and I don't usually talk about this super publicly, but I think it's important to mention, we've also seen, as a result of working with companies, a lot of people quit their organizations, because, and again, I don't usually shout about that when the company's approaching us to work together. So I'm like, I'm going to help your workforce leave. But I think it's important to acknowledge that, if people don't feel like their values are reflected, and they get that external validation of no, caring about this stuff is really important. Oftentimes that does lead to the decision to say, well, I'm going to go and take my skills elsewhere where
I'm not the right person.
Exactly. Yeah. So
Fine.
I try to be that, I guess, agitator and constructive disruptor, but also an ally to people, particularly within sustainability teams, who so often feel really disheartened and quite alienated doing that line of work within their companies.
Okay, amazing. I saw that you saw, was it Kyoto the other night?
Yes.
Was it last night?
So good. Yes.
The next question was going to be, what would you recommend, book, play, film? You can go with Kyoto, or we can go with something else.
Yes. Kyoto is an amazing play about the Kyoto Protocol that was passed, a monumental moment in climate negotiation. I was, a bit timid to go see it because we talked about this, climate is my whole world. And I'm like, if I go to a play, I want some escapism. But it was so well done. I was literally on the edge of my seat. So if you're in London, please go see Kyoto. It is excellent. Such a good crash course into geopolitics and negotiation, but also I think just done in a very hopeful, determined way. And the other recommendation would be this book that I mentioned earlier, Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Solnit. Yep. If you're feeling, really downtrodden by the state of the world, that is such a beautiful balm in trying times.
We will make sure to leave that in the show notes for sure. And Kyoto, I have some theatre vouchers from Christmas that I need to use, and Kyoto is going to be the top of my list. It looks amazing. Mike even spoke about it last week.
Amazing. Yeah.
So speaking about Mike, you asked him a lovely question last week. I think you were sort of challenging and asking around what other narratives and messaging tactics or tools that you found to be effective in not just educating people and alerting them to what's happening, but to actually empowering them to feel that they can create change. And I thought that was an amazing question. And so did Mike, because he wanted to ask you the same thing. Cool. And so right back at you.
Yeah, I would say the most important lesson I've learned as a climate communicator is to really connect to where people already are. I think there's a temptation when you care about an issue for a certain reason to then amplify it from that personal experience. But I think to be more effective, we need to really meet people where they are, understand what they're struggling with, what are they challenged by. Climate can feel really abstract and, again, overwhelming. So being able to connect to experiences that people do have on a day-to-day basis. Maybe it's that they're struggling to pay their energy bills or their food bills, or maybe it's something they've seen in their local community. They don't have access to green space. Again, just grounding it in things that they can actually feel and touch and relate to, so that it doesn't feel like some looming thing that is actually not very immediate for the vast majority of people, but something that they can connect to on an emotional level. That would be my advice.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time. It's been
Oh, thank
amazing. Yeah, and
you.
hopefully to get you back on at some point later down the line. Where can we find you? Socials, all this kind of stuff?
Yes, so you can find me at Clover Hogan on pretty much every platform. I'm afraid I don't go on X much anymore. I'm yet to
Funny
remove my
that.
account altogether, but I'm getting there. And otherwise, you can find Force of Nature at forceofnature.xyz on
Great.
Instagram. You can also find us on LinkedIn. And yeah, we'd love to have a chat.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming into this podcast powered by Leaf Media Global. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple. Please leave a review if you felt inspired. Ask some questions for future guests. We'd love, or make some suggestions for future guests. It will be amazing. But thank you so much for your time, and look forward to the next one.